Can you all hear me? Okay, we're very punctual here at 6:30 on the dot. We've moved our presentation times up a half hour so everyone can get home in time for Masterpiece Theater on PBS. Maybe that's just me, but my name is Erica Suhida. I am the Executive Director of the Neenah Historical Society. I took over in May. I've been with the organization for just over 2 years, so thank you all for being here tonight. Just a couple of quick notes. Raise your hand if you've been to our sesquicentennial exhibit at the Octagon House. That is not enough hands. You only have a few more weeks to come and see it. It closes at the end of October. The Wisconsin State Historical Society granted the exhibit the State Curators Award for the year. So if that's a feather in our cap. So please come see us before the end of October. Next month's presentation will be on Oak Hill Cemetery, presented by yours truly. So come spend a night learning all about the history of the 175-year-old cemetery in Neenah. Our museum coordinator, Miranda, is in the back filming. Wave, Miranda.
Hello.
Say hi, Miranda. She started with us this spring. She's wonderful. She loves living in our archives and collections, so she has pulled a number of items from the Neenah Historical Society collection that coincide with this evening's presentation. So afterwards, please feel free to come up and take a look and talk to Miranda. As always, thanks to Mike Thomas there in the back and the Neenah Public Library for hosting us and putting up with our antics. So the presenter this evening is Kara Rothkegel, and she works in the travel industry by day, but moonlights as a historian. And she has a particular interest in World War II. You may have heard her speak this spring, where she gave a talk on the history of the Red Cross in Neenah during World War II. So this evening, she's talking on a more broad spectrum about the different ways that Neenah mobilized during World War II. So with that, I'll pass it over to Kara. There we go. Okay. As Erica said, I'm Kara Rothkegel, and I'm going to be talking about Neenah during World War II, so how we mobilized here on the Homefront. So to get started, during World War II, life in small towns across America, like Neenah, Wisconsin, were transformed in profound ways. While the battles were fought overseas, the war effort permeated every aspect of daily life back home. From rationing food and materials, to women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers, the people of Neenah, like millions of others, adapted to a rapidly changing world. In this presentation, we're going to explore how the war reshaped civilian life in Neenah, focusing on the sacrifices, challenges, and resilience of the local community during this pivotal period in history. So let's talk about the numbers. We talked about a transforming world during this time, especially on the home front. So between 1940 and 1945, the US labor market grew from 46 million to 53 million as new opportunities arose to support the war effort. Unemployment, which had been around 14.6% in 1940 due to the Great Depression, dropped to just 1.2% by 1944. This was because the country was mobilizing for war, and there was quite an increase in jobs and workers that were needed during this time. Women in the workforce. By 1945, nearly 19 million women were working, a 57% increase from 1940. The iconic Rosie the Riveter symbolized the surge in women taking on industrial and manufacturing jobs, particularly in the defense industries. Women accounted for nearly 37% of the civilian workforce by the war's end, up from 27% before the war. The number of jobs in manufacturing more than doubled, growing from 5 million to nearly 10.7 million. And the federal government became the largest employer in the nation, with civilian employment rising from 1 million in 1940 to over 3.8 million by 1945, as the government needed more personnel to manage wartime production, rationing, and logistics. So quite a massive shift during this time. So one of the biggest things that people in Neenah had to get ready for, this is after Pearl Harbor, and the US federal government is getting ready, they're starting to mobilize and get people moving in 1942. FDR warned, you're gonna have to deal with a lower standard of living. You're gonna have to make sacrifices. There's going to be rationing, we don't know what it will be yet, but he warned the American public, you gotta be ready for it. So, rationing came. Rationing was mandated by the US government in January of 1942. This limited the availability of certain goods and materials and ensured fair distribution given the needs of the war. So establishing maximum or ceiling prices for ration goods also helped to keep inflation in check during this time. Rationing was overseen by the Federal Office of Price Administration, or the OPA, in conjunction with other war offices, including the Wartime Production Board. It was managed at the local level by volunteer rationing boards. At the local rationing offices, people registered for and received their ration books and could apply for ration certificates or additional coupons if needed. When the war ended, over 100,000 citizen volunteers were managing the program, organized into about 5,600 local boards. So in Neenah, the Neenah Ration Board office was located in the Brigade Building. That opened in May 13th, 1942. So each American civilian, regardless of your age, was issued a ration book that contained a specific number of stamps. These stamps were used to purchase rationed items such as food and gasoline. The stamps had to be surrendered along with money when making a purchase for these items. So ration books, there were several types of ration books, and they were distributed over the course of the war, each containing different colored stamps for specific items. Each type of ration item, like meat, sugar, butter, etc., required a certain number of stamps. So people had to plan ahead when they went grocery shopping. They had to purchase carefully because you had to make sure your stamps last. You only had them for a certain amount of time. You were not allowed to use the rationing books of deceased persons or men who had been inducted into the armed forces. So federal regulations stated that within 10 days of someone's death, the ration book must be surrendered to the board. So you actually had to physically go and bring it to the ration offices, the book of the deceased. And if someone was inducted into the service, family members had 30 days to surrender the rationing book over to the rationing board. So here you can see this certificate of registrar. This is for rations. They actually had your height, your weight, what color your eyes were, what color your hair was. They wanted to make sure there wasn't any fraud going on, that you weren't using someone else's book or getting more rations for someone else and you didn't match the description. So it was very, very strict. So one of the first things that was rationed was sugar. In November of 1942, news broke that the government would start, I skipped a page on my end, but a large portion of the US sugar supply before the war came from overseas was from Asia, the Philippines, also in Cuba and other tropical regions. So after Japan invaded the Philippines in 1942, much of the sugar supply from that region was cut off. This created shortages. There was also shipping limitations. So the war significantly affected global shipping routes, as ships were repurposed for military use and were often subjected to attacks by enemy submarines. The military also needed sugar. Sugar was needed not just for civilian consumption, but for military rations, food production, and preservation. The armed forces used sugar in canned goods, and it was an essential ingredient in creating energy-dense food for soldiers. So you were given ½ pound per person per week for your sugar ration. Stamps were actually distributed by the teachers, and they actually had a newspaper article showing how, wow, that goose is really going. It's really going. Excited about the sugar. So the teachers were the ones that actually distributed the ration books first. And one thing I found that was interesting is if you had more than 6 pounds of sugar on hand in your house, no stamps for you. You had to use up your sugar supply before you could go and get your sugar rations. So books came with 28 stamps, and they were good for 2 weeks worth of sugar. And the stamps had to be used during a specific time or they become worthless. So you couldn't just hold on to your rations and use them. Let's say, it's your wife's birthday and you're gonna hold on to the sugar so you can make a cake in 2 months from now. That's not how it worked. They had to be used through a certain time period.
I have a question. So during the war, my grandma had her 2 daughters with their kids and her daughter-in-law with her child living there. Did you get multiple?
So everyone got rations. So even the children would get rations, so that everyone had the same amount of food.
So they all would have to go to the grocery store.
Yeah. Yep. Or you could, I think with kids it was a little different. You could have the ration book, but you had to prove like the last names matched up. So shock and horror, butter and cheese was going to be rations, which is really distressing here in Wisconsin. So in November of 1942, news broke that the government would start rationing butter and cheese to conserve milk. Butter and cheese were key components of military rations. Soldiers needed high-calorie, nutrient-rich foods, and dairy products like cheese provided the much-needed protein and fat. A significant portion of the nation's dairy production was redirected to supply the military. Fats and oils, which are key ingredients in making butter, were in high demand for various military purposes. Does anyone know what those military purposes would be? So the production of explosives. Yeah. So glycerin is derived from fats, and it was used in making explosives like dynamite. So as a result, much of the available fat and oil supply was diverted away from civilian consumption. So like other sectors of agriculture as well, the dairy industry was impacted by labor shortages, as many farm workers and dairy farmers went off to fight in the war. So this decreased the overall output of dairy products, hence the rationing as well. So what was used instead and became widely popular during this time? Does anyone know? And margarine.
Margarine, they all bought.
So this headline was really interesting to me. New ration headache is in store for housewives. So rationing developed as it went on during the war years. It starts with certain products and then it moves on, and then the systems, they changed the systems a little bit too. So the OPA announced in December of 1942 that at the beginning of 1943, not only would consumers need dollars and cents when grocery shopping, you'd have to start using a point system as well. So meat or canned goods was what they said would be the first items that would be on this point system. So the new US ration books contained a certain number of points for each 1 month rationing period. So the OPA fixed a price in points for each kind of meat. The price depended on the current available supplies as well as demand. So how did the housewives and Neenah prepare for this? They went to a meeting to hear all about the point rationing system. So over 250 women attended a meeting sponsored by the Consumers Interest Group at the City Hall auditorium to discuss the new point rationing system. This system started to be used for the purchase of certain canned goods and processed foods first. Later, it was going to be used towards meat. So food was paid for by the ration coupons as well as money, and housewives at this meeting were urged to budget ration points just as she budgets her money to last from payday to payday. So women were reminded that once they were out of ration points, the good cannot be purchased until the next period. So once you're out, you're out. You gotta wait until the next ration period. So rationing was such a huge part of your daily life, planning your meals, how you're gonna feed your family. They like to make some jokes about it too. So it says, had your vitamins today? How about a kiss? She says, did you bring your ration card? So with rationing, the US government started to get concerned about nutrition. How do we make sure the US and our civilians are getting the right foods and the right amount of foods? So nutrition and food became linked with the future of America and of democracy itself. This was a big issue to the US federal government. So starting in 1942, posters promoting nutritional eating were hung up around Neenah. Then in 1943, after 2 years of refinements, because nutrition wasn't a big topic back then. It was just, you had what you had and try to eat the right things, and no one really knew how to understand nutrition, so they didn't have like a pyramid, a table, this pyramid for what you should eat on a daily basis. So they finally came out with a daily dietary allowance, and this was promoted to all families within the US. And they had 7, they called it the basic 7. Exactly, the basic 7. So group 1 was your green and yellow vegetables, and this included how you should eat them or cook them, raw or cooked, frozen or canned, so that was in group 1. Group 2 was your oranges, your tomatoes, grapefruit, in Wisconsin, your raw cabbage, salad greens. Group 3 was potatoes and other vegetables and fruit. Group 4 was your milk and milk products. Group 5 was your meat, poultry, fish, or eggs. Group 6 was your bread, flour, and cereals. And group 7 was butter and fortified margarine. So fortified margarine is with added vitamin A to make sure you're getting all your vitamins. Now here in Neenah, if you really wanted to know about how to eat healthy, you could just listen to the radio. They had radio shows, the Food News Roundup. And this would talk about the latest ration news and food news, and it says at the bottom, how to eat well in wartime. So you could listen to the radio and they'd tell you what you need to do. Along with eating well came the importance of the Victory Garden. Victory Gardens were homegrown vegetable gardens planted by civilians during World War II to help alleviate food shortages and support the war effort. So with much of the commercial food supply going to feed soldiers, citizens were encouraged to grow their own produce in backyards, in vacant lots, and community spaces. These gardens boosted food production, helped reduce the strain on the public food supply, and fostered a sense of patriotism and self-sufficiency among Americans. By 1944, nearly 20 million Victory Gardens were planted, providing around 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables. So you would find in the newspapers at this time how to plant your Victory Gardens. This was the minimum plot dimensions, and then at the top you'll see what they tell you to plant in the rows. So not only were Victory Gardens encouraged as a way to maintain a healthy diet, it was also said it would help to maintain the morale of the individual family and the public. The program called for the growing of food for family consumption in the home. They also had farm and community gardens, and then schools also had their own Victory Gardens. Fruits, flowers, lawns, and shrubs were encouraged as an essential part of American life and a stimulus to national well-being. Youth groups locally, like the 4-H, the Future Farmers of America, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and similar organizations were engaged as workers in the Victory Garden campaigns. Gardening clubs were also encouraged to take active roles in the campaigns for Victory Gardens. On a local level, in March 1943, the Menasha Garden Club sponsored a Garden for Victory campaign. So this campaign was to bring awareness, to get people to start planting Victory Gardens or expanding them. And it started with a poster contest for grades 1st through 6th. Unfortunately, I could not find the results of that poster contest. So. Even local businesses got involved. They changed the way they advertised. This is Kruger's, and they have tips for Victory Gardeners. Includes what seeds to buy, if you need rakes, cultivators, and everything you could possibly need to make your Victory Garden successful. So going from food, also the way you got around changed. There was tire rationing. So tire rationing was introduced due to a critical shortage of rubber, which was essential for military vehicles and equipment. With Japan cutting off much of the world's rubber supply by seizing key rubber-producing regions in the southeast, civilian tires became very scarce. So to conserve this vital resource, tire production for civilian use was severely limited. And the government only allowed individuals deemed essential to the war effort, such as farmers and emergency personnel, to buy new tires. Tire rationing, which began in early 1942, aimed to ensure that the military had enough rubber for the war while encouraging civilians to conserve and maintain their tires. So Neenah had a tire rationing board, and on the board it was your job to decide who got the new tires. So people would send in applications, why they needed a new tire or new tubes, as they say, and then they would decide who got them based on, what they did in their daily life, what was their job, how essential was it to the war effort. So there's an example here in Winnebago County, the quota for January 1942 for tires. Only 45 tires for passenger cars in all of Winnebago County. For trucks, 32 tires. So it was very, and buses, so it was very, very strict. So kids locally were encouraged to bring old tires. They would to collect them and then turn them in for defense stamps. So defense stamps were little like postal stamps. And they were in the smaller denomination, so 10 cents, 25 cents, etc. And then the kids could collect them, and they put them in a war bond stamp book. And then once a person collected enough stamps, they could purchase a larger war bond book. So you're getting all the kids, even the kids involved in this war effort as well. But careful if you left old truck tires around, because more than likely, some kid was out there and would probably grab it from your yard. So the newspaper would often post who got tires. And you could have their names, they had their names there in the news articles. So if you knew someone got a new tire, maybe they had an old one laying around, and you could call them up and see if they had one to spare if you needed one as well. So in addition to tires, you also had gas rationing. So gasoline was rationed to conserve fuel and ensure enough resources also for the military. Starting in 1942, the government issued gas rationing coupons to civilians, limiting the amount of gas they could purchase. These coupons were classified into different categories based on your necessity. So A stickers were the most common, and that allowed for 3 to 4 gallons of gas per week for non-essential driving. B stickers were for workers in essential industries, so those that are directly involved in the war effort. C were for those jobs that were critical to the war effort, like doctors. And T were for truckers and others in transportation. They were allowed unlimited fuel. So in addition to rationing, there was a national speed limit of 35 miles per hour that was set to help conserve fuel. So no pleasure driving, taking Sunday drives. This was strongly discouraged. It was viewed as unpatriotic to go on these pleasure rides. Gas rationing continued until the end of the war, in order to ensure that the military had sufficient fuel for the war effort. So how do you go about getting your gas coupons? You had to register. So every driver had to go and register. There wasn't a specific spot, it just whatever one was closest to you, you went to register. The gas ration committee chairman was Don Colburn, and all drivers had to apply for their gas cards to be able to drive. If you didn't have one, you could not drive. So those who needed more than an A ration card had to form a car sharing club to carry at least 3 people to and from work. So car sharing was very, very big. You've probably seen that ad, that poster, if you're riding alone, you're riding with Hitler. It's a little extreme, but it gets the point across. So basic A rations provided for roughly about 240 miles a month. So here's an example. This is for 500 gallons for a tractor, and this was for use of the next 6 months. So he had to have this in order to operate his tractor. And on the bottom is a mileage ration identification folder, so you can see down there. So collecting, now we're going to talk about what people did to help the war effort in their homes. So collecting scrap rubber was a very big process that everyone participated in. Scrap rubber campaigns urge civilians to contribute their old tires, your old garden hoses, raincoats, and even rubber-soled shoes to support the war effort. So that collected rubber would then be repurposed into essential military supplies, such as tires for vehicles, gas masks, and life rafts. So here there is, they have a collect scrap rubber here, so a collection point for scrap rubber in Neenah. Kids would also get involved. Here they're talking about metal coat hangers. So often they would incentivize kids to get involved. And if you brought 10 metal coat hangers to the Neenah Theater on Saturday, you get to see the matinee for free. So this was an exciting activity for kids to get them involved in the war effort as well. Waste paper. This I found very interesting. I had no idea. Waste paper was extremely important to the war effort. It was critical as paper was essential for packaging war supplies, making ammunition containers, and printing military manuals and maps. The government encouraged civilians, including school children and community groups, to gather newspapers, magazines, cardboard, and other paper products. In cities and small towns like Neenah, paper drives were often held, and citizens stored and bundled their waste paper to be picked up by local organizations. This collective effort helped alleviate severe paper shortages, ensuring that essential supplies could be efficiently shipped to soldiers fighting abroad. So here's some ads that were in the paper. Even a candy bar wrapper was considered waste paper that could be saved and used for the efforts. 100 pounds of your waste paper makes 550 cartons for K rations. That's what the soldiers needed. K rations were what they ate from. This is a citywide waste paper collection, so that was on September 22nd, I think it was 1944. They had a 31-ton record in Neenah for how much waste paper was collected. So they were trying to beat that. So one of the groups or organizations that did a lot of waste paper drives was the Boys Brigade. More than 30 tons, they were the ones that collected more than 30 tons of paper. That set the record for Neenah. And it was needed by mills throughout the country if plant operations were to be continued without shutdowns. So before they even weighed what they had back at the brigade, they had 29.6 tons. That was at the city scales. So that wasn't even including what they still had at the brigade. And there were about 200 members of the Boys Brigade that participated in these pickups. Kitchen fat, cooking fat. Save your cooking fat. So cooking fat became an unexpected but a very valuable resource on the home front. It was used to produce, like we said, glycerin, which was a key ingredient in explosives. And the government urged civilians to save grease from bacon, meat drippings, and other cooking fats, which were then turned in at a local butcher or a collection center. Just 1 pound of fat could provide enough glycerin to make a pound of gunpowder. So this was very important. The campaign united communities, and it shows us that turning ordinary kitchen waste turned it into an essential war supply. Neenah also had book collections. These books were collected and sent overseas or to local hospitals for soldiers, sent over to the Navy to put on ships, to boost the morale of US troops. So they had a book collection where they collected over 600 volumes. This was done in collaboration between the Red Cross and the American Library Association and the USO. So they urged civilians, if you're done with that book, go donate it. Go give it to the Red Cross so they can send it overseas to soldiers. So things changed quite a bit for everyone, but especially for women. So let's talk about the superficial things first. So what you wore changed. Women's fashion in the US underwent significant changes during World War II. It reflected the practical needs and patriotic spirit of the era. Due to fabric rationing and the scarcity of materials like silk, wool, and nylon, women's clothing became more utilitarian and less extravagant. So that's an ad for Marion Martin, her Victory Fashions. It's a pattern book there. And then stockings you couldn't get new stockings, silk stockings. Silk was needed for parachutes. So you could wear liquid stockings. What is liquid stockings, you ask? It's basically self-tanner. Self-tanner makes it look like you're wearing stockings. Makes your legs slightly darker than they should be. I don't know how that washes off. Not really sure how that works, but you could get it at Janner's. Women were also encouraged to give away their nail files. Nail files were made from steel. So they, this to me just kind of showed how something seemingly insignificant in your household, like a nail file, played a role in supporting the war. So women were also strongly encouraged to join military branches as well. Approximately 150,000 women served in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. So initially established as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, so WAC, in 1942 it became the WAC in 1943, allowing women to serve as full members of the Army. These women took on a variety of non-combat roles, including clerks, telephone operators, mechanics, and they worked in logistics, which were critical in supporting the war efforts. Women were allowed to serve both stateside and overseas in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. So this really broke new ground for women in the military. So when local women joined, their names were put in the paper, who their parents were, where they worked prior to this, and if they knew where they were going to be sent for training, they would put that in the paper as well. So one of these, I know they had a big party, a family dinner in her honor. They're entertaining her. They had a big family party before she was sent off for training. Recruiters would come to Neenah to try to get some more women to join, and WAC was seeking 400 recruits from the Valley in total at one point in time. So they were really pushing for women to join in the military as well. But it wasn't just the Army Corps. The Marine Corps was seeking women leathernecks. It's an interesting name for it. So there was also the Waves, which was for the Navy, and the Coast Guard had the Spars, and the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASPs, they were also recruiting in the Valley as well. They would work as nurses, clerks, radio operators, pilots, mechanics, and many other support roles that freed up men for combat duties. During World War II, approximately 23,000 women served in the Marine Corps Women's Reserve, and approximately 100,000 women served in the Waves, or for the Navy. We would see a lot of ads like this in the paper as well. Kimberly-Clark Corporation needs women workers. So women dramatically expanded their presence in the workforce as they took on roles previously held by men who were serving in the military. Women filled positions in factories, shipyards, and other industrial sites, producing munitions, aircraft, and other essential wartime materials. During World War II, Kimberly-Clark employed around 8,000 women at its various plants across the United States. As the company shifted its focus to producing essential war materials, including medical supplies, bandages, and other products critical to the war effort, women played a crucial role in these operations. Their contributions helped maintain production levels and support the Allied forces, reflecting a broader trend of women stepping into various industrial roles during the war. So businesses changed during this time as well. They changed what they sold to people. They changed their business practices, how they advertised as well. Many small manufacturers and workshops retooled their operations to produce parts or components needed for military supplies. Retailers adapted by selling war bonds, conserving resources and managing shortages of goods due to rationing. Restaurants dealt with food rationing by offering simplified menus and finding creative substitutes for scarce ingredients. Service-oriented businesses like repair shops thrived during this time. Why do you think that is? Couldn't buy new. You had to make do with what you had. So retailers in Neenah all banded together, and in Menasha, to do a victory drive. So every retailer in Neenah and Menasha was asked to participate. At this time, 1 million retailers throughout the US were asked by the United States Treasury Department to sell $1 billion worth of war savings bonds and stamps just during July. This is in, I believe it was 1942, just in July.
What are today's dollars at?
I don't know what that would be.
Just
Might have been more.
$35.
So retail organizations included in the drive were, they sold dry goods, were department stores, grocery stores, drug and cigar stores, wholesale establishments, meat markets, retail gas stations, plumbing establishments, flower shops, basically anyone that had a retail store was asked to contribute to this victory drive. It wasn't just the stores, banks also got involved. Banks in Neenah and Menasha participated in victory loan drives. So the US government began these drives in 1942. They encouraged American citizens to lend money to the government by purchasing bonds, which funded military expenses and helped to stabilize the economy. In 1942, their goal was to borrow $9 million. So these victory loan drives were highly successful. They not only met but often exceeded their financial goals, demonstrating the strong sense of patriotism and public support for the war effort among Americans. The final victory loan drive in late 1945 aimed to raise $11 billion, but ended up raising over $21 billion. So overall, the series of bond drives during the war, including the victory loan drive, raised more than $185 billion. This was crucial in funding military operations, supporting troops, and managing the economic challenges of the war and its aftermath. So these were in the newspapers. These were for all the bond drives that were done locally in Neenah and Menasha. Companies also joined in to assist in these drives. So this article talks about the Menasha corporations hitting their quota of $441,370 in the fifth war loan drive in 1944. So this was the fifth drive that Menasha corporations had oversubscribed their allotment. So throughout the war, they had always exceeded their goals for allotments. Local paper mills. Bergstrom Paper Company, Kimberly-Clark, Neenah Paper, and Marathon Paper mills all donated used felts for blankets. These were sent over to Britain. Businesses changed what they were selling. During World War II, you really didn't need to go to the jewelers very often. Probably weren't buying your wife new diamonds or anything. So they were selling female writing kits instead over at Hartle's Jewelers. $1 was the price. It came with a container basically to make sure all the V-mail was kept securely and in one place. Jandry sold V-mail stationery and envelopes. It says, morale is intangible, but it wins wars. That was how they started advertising for these things.
What exactly was V-mail again?
V-mail was how you could write letters to those that were serving overseas. So this is an example of V-mail. Do you see how small the envelope is? They basically shrunk your mail down. So your letter was probably a standard letter, and they shrunk it down so it would fit into these smaller envelopes, and it was easier for the soldiers to carry around. Also a great way to read what your letters are saying, so you're not giving away important information. So local businesses were also given awards for their services. The Neenah paper was cited at e-presentation, and this was awarded for meritorious and distinguished service for their country in its time of need. So basically what it meant is not one shipment of Neenah paper product that was given to the armed forces was rejected, resulting in their outstanding record. So they passed all the quality controls with flying colors, didn't waste the government's time with sending things back because it wasn't correct. So Neenah Paper was making bond paper. They made paper for the Corps of Engineer and Army Map Service, and blueprint paper for the Air Corps.
Was the E for excellence?
You know, it never said that in the articles, it just said e-presentation. So That sounds about right, probably. Excellent, an excellence award. So this is a picture here of them accepting that, the Army Navy E. They had a big party for all of the employees and their families. Over 600 employees and their families attended this ceremony when they were presented with the E presentation. The Neenah Paper Company was given 4 awards for their service during the war. Kimberly Clark says, from paper to guns. So Kimberly Clark made big changes to production during World War II. They manufactured hundreds of heavy, power-driven anti-aircraft guns. They were highly complicated guns, and they were designed to fire so rapidly that it could bring down a low-level bomber flying at a speed of 300 to 400 miles per hour. The machine shops at Kimberly Clark manufactured landing gear for bombers. They made bomb parts, Victory cargo winches, gun sights, and more. They continued with paper products as well for the military. They made insulation for Allied troop housing. They made crepe wadding for protecting products in transit. They made camouflage paper, collapsible gasoline bags, medical supplies, and more. So this is an example of the anti-aircraft guns that they made. So they completely shifted the way their machine shops and their factories were operating at that time. Neenah natives were put onto national boards. So Ernst Mahler was the executive vice president of Kimberly Clark. He was among 11 civilians appointed by the War Department to act as an advisory committee on Army procurement. John R. Kimberly was the director of Kimberly Clark Corporation, had been appointed the assistant chief of the Bureau of Industry Operations for the War Board. So Neenah natives were operating at a national level as well. Even restaurants were getting in on the war fever, I guess. But this says, just like Rosie the Riveter, our Winnie the waitress is doing her share of the war effort. She's serving the public nutritious, well-balanced meals to keep them on the job. So this was for Hanson's Cafe. Citizens could get involved as well. Civilian defense was one big way for Neenah civilians to get involved in the war effort directly. The civilian defense was a coordinated effort by the US government and local communities to protect the home front and support the war effort. It was organized under the Office of Civilian Defense, established in 1941. These programs involved millions of American civilians who volunteered as air raid wardens, firefighters, medical responders, and in other emergency roles. Responsibilities included conducting blackout drills, enforcing air raid precautions, patrolling for enemy aircraft, and organizing community preparedness efforts. Basically what they were trying to do is make sure that if the worst happened here in Neenah, Wisconsin, that they were ready for it. They had systems in place, they had people that knew what their jobs were to make sure that the community stayed safe as a whole. So the mayor in 1942 called on Neenah citizens to volunteer for the civilian defense. And often in the papers, almost daily, you would see this Neenah Wakes to Civilian Defense, and it would just give you updates on what was happening in the community, what was new, what you could join. So the Defense Council aimed to recruit and train an organization that was capable of handling any emergency. Volunteers were told to register at the Office of Civilian Defense on the second floor of City Hall, and all those that were accepted by the organization then began a period of training in their assigned area. So if you wanted to join the auxiliary firefighting unit of Neenah, you had to fill out this form here and turn it in. They also had local bomb squads that was part of the civilian defense. They had members that were part of the demolition and clearance squad. So regular civilians were learning how to dismantle bombs. I don't know how they prepared for that, but I didn't see anywhere about a bomb going off anywhere in Neenah, so it must have gone well. Boys and some girls could go into the messenger corps. So boys 12 years and older could join. And if there was, basically what their job was, if there was an attack and the telephone lines were down, cables were broken by explosives, the boys on their bikes would serve as messengers between certain points within the town. So to commandant troop movement, where people need to be, that was their job. They would ride their bikes, and everyone knew where they were supposed to go. They had specific stations that they would be at should something happen. So 52 messenger boys enrolled in the local CD. They were also given first aid training. So all of these boys were trained in first aid, so if something happened, that they could assist civilians as well. Blackouts happened in Neenah as well. They did blackout testing. They did county-wide blackouts. So along with the air raid wardens, fire watchers, auxiliary firemen would perform these drills, and the results were then reported back to the Wisconsin Council of Defense. This measured the effectiveness of the blackout, the number of violations during the blackouts, and the cooperation of the public. So all this was done so Neenah could be prepared for the worst, and that citizens knew what to do in these types of situations. Girl Scouts. The Girl Scouts were heavily involved as well. Girl Scouts in Neenah and Menasha were active in assisting. They raised money for funds to aid needy children in war-torn countries. They acquired knowledge on simple machine tools. They took first aid classes, cleaned and strung buttons for Red Cross garments, and even made toys for refugee children and gifts for servicemen. Churches. Churches played a vital role on the home front during World War II. They provided spiritual support, community solidarity, and practical assistance to those affected by the war. They organized prayer services, offered counseling, and provided comfort to families with loved ones that were serving overseas. Many congregations supported troops by assembling care packages. This right here in the picture, we also have a copy of it up at the front. This is what they would send to local troops for Christmas. So it's a little booklet. It had two letters there in the front, but what I thought was really interesting is that they included pictures of Neenah, so they could remember what home looks like. Pictures of Neenah covered in snow during Christmas time, just to remind them of what they're fighting for. This was sent out by the First Presbyterian Church. So they also have sewing circles to produce blankets and clothing for soldiers, also for refugees. And churches helped foster a sense of hope and resilience during this time. And they used their platform to encourage patriotism and support the war effort as a whole. So I hope by the end of this, you've seen how the community as a whole all came together during World War II. Everyone, at some point, every part of your life was touched by the war, whether it was through rationing, what activities you participated in. In fact, if you weren't assisting in any way, if you weren't doing drives or buying war bonds, it was downright unpatriotic. So I hope that you could see by the end of this presentation how daily life in Neenah changed during this time.
You had talked about sugar rationing and that they couldn't get more sugar until they used up what they had.
Mm-hmm.
They were on their honor. How could they know if they had sugar used up?
You just had to be honest. So they weren't getting, that much more per week. So I'm not sure if they didn't have anyone coming around to the houses to make sure that you didn't have 6 pounds or more hanging around, but you basically.
I saw that too. It's like you're cooking with it.
Yeah, and canning and
like you do now.
yeah, so canning was a big thing at that time too. When you had your vegetables and your fruits from your victory gardens, you needed sugar for canning purposes too. So.
The other things.
I did not know Casey did the machinery.
Yeah.
My mom worked there during the war, and all she said that they made were Kotex pads for dressings. That's when they were experimenting. And
Yes, that is kind of when Kotex, the Kotex pads kind of really came into being then.
medical stuff comes out of the wars.
Mhm.
Vietnam was the same way.
So there's a book up there called Cooperation, and it goes into detail on what Neenah did during that time or what Kimberly Clark did during that time for production purposes.
I'm sorry if you covered this before I came in, but were there any USO canteens or anything in the area?
Not that I could find, no. I didn't see any mention about USL canteens here.
Does your research indicate if there was any kind of a agricultural push to grow certain crops at certain times? Like for instance, sugar beets would have made up for that. Did they go to farmers and say, plant this instead of this?
I'm pretty sure they did. I don't know what they were telling them to do. I just know that a big part of that problem is just the labor shortage that they had. So that's why they pushed so hard for the victory gardens for people, so that they could take care of their own, fruits and vegetables at a smaller level. But I do know, I did read that they pushed for other things to be planted over, corn or something, but I can't recall what that was exactly.
Well, thank you, Kara. And please, before you leave, if you'd like to come and take a look at the items we have on display